It's hot. We've got these two air conditioners on, so we're just hoping the place remains okay for the length of time we're going to be here. And just to let you know, as Linda Santalocci just said, his books are beautifully laid out there. They're $25 each, and Dr. Rabkin's books are there. And Larry's read the book already, and he gave it the gold seal of approval.
Yes.
Did you? Did you?
The Larry Haven seal of approval.
Yeah. Yeah, he read it as an e-book. Yeah.
Discounted. It's $35 now.
Oh, it's discounted from $35. So with that $10, you can give us a donation, because right after Dr. Rabkin speaks, we're going to be passing, before the question period, we're going to be passing around a basket, because we need to cover the various costs associated, including renting this room, costs associated with bringing him here from Montreal, all the way from Montreal. We brought him on the plane, and he's been staying in a small hotel. My name's Judy Haven, and I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. By day, you might see me around because, at the back, sir, there are chairs. I teach in Commerce and the Management Department at St. Mary's University, but by night, a lot of what I do has to do with trying to organize people to understand more about Israel's illegal and brutal occupation of Palestinian lands. I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and they're the people, we're the people here, and so is Dr. Rabkin from Montreal, but we're the people that have organized this tour. I'll just tell you a bit about him. Yakov Rabkin was born and educated in the Soviet Union. He's a professor of history at the Université de Montreal, where he's taught since 1973. He's been associated with CERIUM, Center for Research on International Relations. His areas of interest include Russian-Soviet history, science, technology studies, and contemporary Jewish history. He's the author of Science Between the Superpowers, co-editor of Interaction Between Scientific and Jewish Cultures, and editor of Diffusion of New Technologies in the Post-Communist World. His book, A Threat from Within, A Century of Jewish Opposition to Zionism, published by Zed Books, is now available in 15 languages. That book was nominated for the Governor General's Award in Canada and included in the list of the 3 best books of the year by Japan's daily Asahi Shimbun. His most recent book, What is Modern Israel? Pluto, University of Chicago Press, 2016, is on sale right over here. Professor Rabkin has published over 300 articles and book chapters and has done work on science and technology, in economies in transition, and in non-Western societies. Dr. Rabkin has served as an expert witness for the Standing Committee on External Affairs and International Trade of the Parliament of Canada. He has represented Canada at the OECD on issues related to international assistance to science in the former socialist countries. He is fluent in 5 languages: English, French, Hebrew, Russian, and Spanish. Yakov Rabkin has been invited to comment on international affairs in both print and electronic media. So I'd like to just give the platform to him, and he'll be talking for maybe, I think, 45 minutes or so. And then I'll pass the basket, and we'll have some coffee, and then questions. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me in the back as well. Can you? Yeah. I'm very pleased to be in Halifax. It's my second talk here. I gave one on Thursday, and so I see some of the people came here to hear me again, so I have to be very careful not to repeat myself. However, I may repeat myself because yesterday afternoon I was in the local Orthodox synagogue, and they also asked me to say a few words. So perhaps that's where I will begin, because the title of today's talk was invented by Judy and Larry, not by myself. But since that's the title, it necessarily places me in a very religious realm. So one of the things that we read yesterday in the synagogue, and that's in the book of Deuteronomy, has to do with a very unusual commandment. You know, the Jewish tradition believes that there are 613 commandments, and one of them, only one, is formulated in a very special way. It says, pursue justice. And it says actually twice the word justice. Tzedek, tzedek, tzedek. Normally commandments we don't pursue. I mean, if I have to help an elderly person, but there is no elderly people here, I'm not going to run around and look for one. If I'm supposed to do something, say, to respect a scholar, if there's no scholar around me, there's no way for me to perform this commandment. But as far as justice is concerned, I have to pursue it. I have to really go in, even if the justice is not available. Because this is something that we have to really look forward to. And justice is something which also has to be pursued by just means. That's why in the commandment that I just mentioned, you should pursue justice. The word justice is mentioned twice. But justice has to be pursued by just means as well. I mentioned that because many people who are active in support for Palestinians, and therefore they deplore and criticize what the Zionist movement and Israel has done to the Palestinians for the last 120 years. These people, in a way, may be animated by this yearning for justice. I say may because it's very difficult to judge someone else's motivations. And I certainly don't arrogate the right to see what people's motivations are. But by and large, what I hear is that it's a matter of justice. And therefore, the question that was put in the title of today's talk, how can an observant Jew criticize Israel? I would just turn it around and say, well, how can an observant Jew not criticize Israel? Because if observant Jew means commitment to certain moral values, not only to ritual practices, which are also important, but also to moral values, there are some problematic things that have been done, and have been done in the name of Jews. Because one of the important issues here is that there's a lot of injustice generally in the world. But some of it is done, committed, in the name of certain groups. Now we are very aware that a lot of terrorist activities are going on in the name of Islam. And therefore, there are many Muslim scholars who actually explain that it's an aberration and so on. So they explain why, they explain because they're Muslim, and in the name of Islam, certain very unseemly things are being done. That's why I think for an observant Jew, it's perfectly, almost obligatory to intervene and to express and to explain to the public the difference between an independent state in Western Asia, which is called the State of Israel, and Jews that live all around the world. That's one very important distinction to be made. Because in the media, in daily parlance, we say Jewish state, Hebrew state. We confuse Jews with Israel, we confuse Judaism with Zionism. And therefore, unfortunately, Jews and Jewish institutions are blamed for what the Israeli army does in Gaza. I'm convinced that the decision-making in Israel, decision makers, pay absolutely no attention to the welfare and interest of Jewish communities elsewhere. And therefore, they have absolutely no impact on what Israel does. They may be enthusiastic supporters, they may have demonstrations, they may raise money and send money, but they don't have any policy input. And I think that's a very important thing. But even more importantly is to understand that one should not conflate Judaism and Zionism, because if they are the same thing, then the question asked in the title of today's talk is indeed legitimate. How can it be? Let me say in a few words that Zionism is a political movement. It is a movement that originated almost 120 years ago in Europe, in the context of European nationalism, by people of Jewish descent, and as I developed it much more on Thursday, under a strong influence of Protestant Christian attitude towards Hebrews and in gathering of the Hebrews in the Holy Land. And I'll be happy to explain it further. I'm just mentioning it because a few people heard me on Thursday. So, the founders of political Zionism, who were deeply de-Judaized, they really abandoned the tradition, abandoned the practice. They believed that they were something that they phrased as secular Jews. And we'll come to it in a second. And they wanted, in particular the founder of political Zionism, Herzl, a Viennese journalist, very prominent one, playwright, charismatic personality. He wanted to solve the Jewish problem. And his first idea was to convert all the Jews to Christianity. It didn't work out on both ends. There was no enthusiasm for that mass action. But his second idea, also under the influence of this Protestant chaplain in the British Embassy in Vienna, his second idea was to create a nation state for the Jews. This was a revolutionary idea. Revolutionary for Jewish history, not at all revolutionary for Central and Eastern Europe, where it originated. In Central and Eastern Europe, may I remind you, many national groups, Lithuanians, Poles, Ukrainians, Estonians, longed for autonomy and independence, but were ruled by empires, like the Russian Empire, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German Empire, Ottoman Empire. So the nationalist feeling, the idea that a nation has to have its own country and rule itself, was very common. And therefore, that's where really political Zionism comes from. To have a country for that particular national group. The only problem is that Jews then, and I would say today, don't feel that they belong to the same nation in the sense of European nationalism. They belong definitely to it's the same religious group. Some Jewish groups may have certain commonality among themselves. For example, East European Jews, that's the majority of Jews in English Canada, for example, they're mostly of Eastern European descent. Their grandparents may have spoken Yiddish, they have certain gastronomic commonalities, so it could be considered an ethnic group. But if you compare them with Moroccan Jews or Yemenite Jews, well, that's where comparison ends, because there is nothing in common, except religion. But if you evacuate religion, if the religion is not there, then they really have very little in common. So to apply the idea of nationalism to Jews was extremely daring. In fact, so daring that many Jews, I would say most Jews at that time, protested this. And let me explain why it was so abhorrent to some Jews that they would be considered a separate nation. In 1882, in Germany, a new group took shape, and they called themselves anti-Semites. They proudly called themselves anti-Semites. They formed anti-Semitic League, and they were opposed to the Semites. Now, who are the Semites in Europe? Semites, it's a group that is defined by language. Well, they're a Semitic group of languages, but there was never a Semitic nation or a Semitic ethnic group, so there was a total invention. But it appeared much more palatable with just to say that they're anti-Jewish. In fact, they say they're anti-Semitic. And this anti-Semitic league postulated the Jews are a foreign nation in the body of whatever, German, French, or whatever nation it may be. They are foreigners, they don't belong, and therefore they should be discriminated against, and in the ultimate very sad occurrence, as you're familiar with, they should be physically destroyed, as happened during the First World War. So the anti-Semitic idea that Jews don't belong, that they constitute a foreign nation, was of course abhorrent to Jews. Now when the Zionists came, yes, indeed, you don't belong here, you belong somewhere else, it dovetailed very much with this anti-Semitic discourse. And that's one of the reasons that the idea of Jews as a separate nation certainly didn't attract tremendous enthusiasm. Not in Germany, not in France, not in England, not in the United States. And in fact, till today, the countries I've just mentioned supplied very few immigrants to...
I'm so sorry, somebody's walking in.
Supplied very few immigrants to Israel. Most of the Jews in the United States, Canada, France, Germany stay where they are. And I think it is very important to understand that the invention of the Jewish people as a nation, and I'm using the title of book by Shlomo San, my colleague from Tel Aviv University, the idea that they belong to one nation is a very problematic idea, and it's a very recent one. But it is the basis of the Zionist movement. So you may ask, and some of you definitely must have asked yourselves, well, if there was no support, how did the Zionist movement succeed after all? Well, it succeeded thanks to a particular set of circumstances that existed at the turn of the 20th century in the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was different from the other empires I mentioned. In Austro-Hungary, in Germany, German Empire, in British Empire, in France, Jews had civil rights. They were equal citizens. There was a degree of discrimination, but it was more on a social level than official level, and that's why anti-Semitic League was resentful of the entry of Jews into the professions, into high society, and so on. So these Jews certainly were not recruits for the Zionist movement. Now, who were Jews in the Russian Empire? Because Jews in the Russian Empire did not have equal rights. They had to be living in a certain area of the Russian Empire on the western borderlands, which today are the Baltic republics, Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and in the Caucasus something else. So you have that group of Jews living, several million Jews, living in western borderlands of the Russian Empire under conditions of oppression and, from 1881, sporadic violence. And that sporadic violence actually provided a new word for the English language, pogroms. It's a Russian word which entered many vocabularies in different languages. From 1881, after the assassination of Alexander II, the emperor, there was an outburst of anti-Jewish sentiment and violence, and that led to tremendous destabilization of Jewish communities, which, I repeat, found themselves in very different circumstances from Jews in France, Germany, Britain, and elsewhere. But there was something in common also between them. When Jews received equal rights and were no longer obliged to live in ghettos and so on, this happened more or less at the turn of the 19th century, plus minus, in different Western and Central European countries. Many of these Jews availed themselves of the opportunity to relax their ritual practices. Some of them decided altogether stop being Jews. They changed names, they married non-Jews, and that disappeared in nature more or less. Others developed a reform movement which I would say reduced the number of ritual obligations and made Judaism appear both graphically and ideologically like Protestant Christianity, because it happened in northern Germany, and they were very concerned about being accepted as another religion among German citizens. Quite a few Jews, as you can guess, didn't want to be Jewish. They just left it. And they could do it, because Jews could leave their small towns in, say, Alsace in France and move to Paris and change name and marry a non-Jew, and within a generation you wouldn't even tell. In the Russian Empire, it was an impossibility. So what you have in the Russian Empire, you have the same cultural movement, secularization, abandonment of ritual practices, but no possibility of not being Jew, because they can't move. And so it's in the Russian little towns, the shtetls, that form a totally new concept, a secular Jew. Secular Jew, because these people wanted to call themselves in a more positive way, because the Jewish traditional parlance has many terms for Jews who abandon practice. They are evildoers, transgressors, but no one wants to be called like that, right? So they call themselves secular Jews. And they affirm that we have a special culture. And our culture is Yiddish. And there was a real explosion of cultural creativity around the Yiddish language in the southern Russia, in Odessa in particular. You had Yiddish theater, You had all of this creativity that later spilled into North America and Europe, because from 1881 on, about 1.5 million Russian Jews left and became citizens in countries of North America, South America, and Europe. 1% of them followed the Zionist movement and settled in Palestine. 1%. A very small group. And since it was a small group, you can understand that they were the most ideologically motivated to make Zionism work. They were young socialists, wanted to build a new country, a new society without exploitation. Those who founded settlements in Palestine at the turn of the 20th century, mostly, by and large, were Russian origin. Some of them had it as a native language. And their influence, that small group, their influence on Israeli and Zionist movement and Israeli politics has been extremely strong. Just to mention one detail that illustrates that perfectly well. In 1962, 60% of the members of Israeli parliament were born in the Russian Empire. There hadn't been any immigration from the Soviet Union after 1920. Which means that that original group really kept the power. And till today, all the Israeli prime ministers were either born in Russian Empire or were born of parents who were born in Russian Empire, without exception. And it's not a cabal, it's not conspiracy, I'm not talking about any of that. It's just that culturally and politically, they created a new country, they created a new society, and therefore they are essentially running it. And another proof of the importance of Russian Jews, that when Soviet Jews started arriving in mass, and they didn't arrive for ideological reasons, it was more or less economic immigration at the time of the instability in the former Soviet Union, they entered the political system as if it were theirs. Within a few years, they had 5 ministers in the government who were former Soviet citizens. You have Minister of Defense today, Lieberman, who was former Soviet citizen, because it's their system. It is their culture, their political culture. And what characterizes this political culture, and I didn't forget the subject of our conversation today, is that they belong to the Jewish nationality. They don't belong to Jewish religion. They assume that they are secular Jews, and as the Soviet Union classified them, they were belonging to nationality Jewish, just like Uzbeks or Ukrainians or Russians or whatever, Chechens. So for them, enter the Israeli system is perfectly easy, because they think we are a nation, and we have rights, and in particular, we have no religious obligation, we have no moral scruples connected with Judaism. We are not concerned about what in Jewish parlance is called sanctification or profanation of the name of God, which is a tremendously important motivation for Jews. You don't do certain things because it sheds, say, bad light on Jews, because if you do something wrong, or on the contrary, if you do something right, creates a good impression, and so on. And that's very important. But for these people, it doesn't exist. And therefore, these groups of secular Jews who built the country, for whom it is their national right to be there, they have the most, I would say today, Russian-speaking Jews in Israel, and they are about 20% of the population, about the same number as Palestinian citizens of Israel. They by far voted much more further to the right of the mainstream Israeli, and they constitute a very important element of Israeli society. In my book, there is a whole chapter about the Russian dimension of the Zionist project and Israeli society, and I emphasize it because here we have a dichotomy. We have religious Jews, observant Jews on the one hand, and secular Jews. And secular Jews, of course, not all of them are right-wing. We have to understand that people who build the country were socialists, they belong to the left-wing movements. Many of their descendants, because they are no longer alive, many of their descendants are active in Israeli peace movements, but it's a shrinking population. It's a shrinking population because many of them find today's Israel unacceptable. Many of them emigrate. You have, actually, it's ironic that today the largest concentration of Israelis in Europe is in Berlin. And they are largely sort of left-wing secular Jews. Israelis, sorry. I made a mistake myself. So secular Jews are not a united group, but what is important is for religious Jews, the religious group are also not a united group. I mentioned the Reform movement, I mentioned other groups, but what is important to see is that for observant Jews, there is a religious obligation. They feel a religious obligation to pursue justice. So if something is done in my name, it says, and I consider it unjust, what is being done to the Palestinians, say, the destruction of the 3 villages that you are familiar with, but it's just one drop in many other things that happen. Then the Jew feels that he or she is obliged to do something about it. Be it protest, be it voting, whatever it may be it organizational behavior of different kinds. But in Israel, there is a group called Rabbis for Human Rights. I think Rabbi Arik Asherman is the founder of it. For them, their activity is motivated entirely by religious reasons. They try to save Palestinian homes from destruction, sometimes chain themselves to fences. They help Palestinians harvest olives because they're often abused by settlers. And of course the rabbis for human rights are also abused. It's not pleasant. But it's important to understand that for people who are motivated by religious imperative of justice, this is natural behavior. It's not surprising behavior. And then you would say, well, but there must be some solidarity among Jews. We've heard so much about solidarity among Jews. They help each other. How can they criticize other Jews? And how can they do it in public? In fact, I wrote my previous book about Jewish opposition to Zionism. And I met really prominent ideologues of anti-Zionism, of religious Jews, very religious Jewish anti-Zionism. And I asked them, you go and demonstrate, and don't you think that what you do put other Jews in danger? Because that's a question that was often addressed to me. How can these people, these very, very religious Jews, dressed in black and white and big black hats and all that, wave Palestinian flags and say, we support Palestinian struggle? So how can they do it? People asked me, and I asked this question. And they brought a statement from Maimonides, the Jewish rabbi, scholar, doctor of about 1,000 years ago, who said that if someone publicly states makes a wrong statement about Judaism. Say, Jews, well, just to give you a very innocent example. If I stand in the street and say, for Jews, the holy day is Wednesday. Wednesday, I think it's Wednesday. Then another Jew who sees me do it has to come up to me and say, no, you're wrong. It's Sabbath. So if there's misrepresentation of Judaism, there's an obligation to stand up and say, that's wrong. Now, here we're getting to less innocent things. Like if someone says, we're doing, for example, we have a commandment, like many settlers on the territories that Israel acquired in 1967, many of them say it's a religious commandment for us to settle every square inch of the land and not allow and not to have any pity on anyone else. It's a commandment. Then it's an obligation for those who know better to come up and say, no, it's not. It's not a commandment. Of course, as you know, there are 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So it's a very common thing. But there is a certain body of, I would say, consensual Judaism, the Jewish tradition, that we can rely on. And in fact, people who religiously justify oppression of Palestinians and the dispossession and all that, they constitute till today a minority. It's a tiny minority, it's a very active minority, it's an armed minority too. Because those whom you see as very religious, you know, black and white, usually they don't go to the army. In fact, they protest against going to the army. They're marginal to the Zionist project in Israel and Palestine. So, therefore, it's very important to emphasize for an observant Jew that that political doctrine that uses Judaic terms is a departure from Jewish tradition. And therefore, I have my watch.
Okay, good.
And therefore, there is a very active debate in Israel in particular about this new national Judaism. When my book, not this previous book, came out in Hebrew in Israel, and I was interviewed by different media, but I was also interviewed by the settlers radio station. And they were very interested because many of them are very honest people. They really think they're doing God's work and they're really religiously motivated. And for them to see a whole book where I explain that what they're doing is really a departure from Jewish tradition, it disturbs them. So they asked me, why did you write the book? I said, because I wanted to stimulate debate in Israel about what Judaism is. And in fact, the debate does take place. And some of the leaders of this national Judaism are honest enough to say, yes, indeed, we belong to a new Judaism. At the moment they say that, and I'm not passing a moral judgment, then we are talking about 2 different kinds of Judaism. Of course, there are more than 2, but at least when they admit that it's not, they are not the culmination of the Jewish history for the last 2,000 years. It's a revolution, which early Zionists admitted willingly that they were a revolutionary movement. Today's leaders don't do that. Today's leaders, like Netanyahu, would show a ring and say, look, here's a ring that was brought to me by archaeologists, and it has the name Netanyahu on it. And therefore, there's tremendous continuity, forgetting that his father changed the name, and in fact, there's some Eastern European name, Smidansky or Svilansky. But you know, we are not talking about rational issues. We are talking about emotional issues, because Netanyahu made that statement, if I'm not mistaken, among a very august gathering of US Congress. these people are extremely rational, as you know, and, and it went just wonderfully well. But seriously, what we are talking about is a new Judaism, if you like, and a new identity. And for many Jews here in Halifax and elsewhere, this new identity of supporting Israel is pretty much the only Jewish thing they do. They've long abandoned ritual practices and kosher food and the Sabbath, and they've become much more relaxed about it. But they stand for Israel, and they give money to Israel. It's their identity. It's what they are. Now you understand that to criticize Israel for them is totally inadmissible, because I'm attacking their identity. And they're extremely defensive. You know, it's a private issue. You are not allowed to discuss something that belongs to my identity. So the defensiveness and immediate accusation of anti-Semitism and self-hating Jew, and that comes precisely from that sense of offense. So you have to understand where it comes from. I would say, and for these people, the only Jewish thing they do, they think that that's Jewish, is to support Israel. They're also a group of people for whom the only Jewish thing they do is to criticize Israel. They don't do anything other Jewish, but they criticize Israel. And they think that that's what makes them Jewish, and that's their Jewish activity, so to speak. So Israel has formed an identity, a positive and a negative identity, if you like, here and elsewhere in the world. But what it shows you, and I think it shows quite convincingly, that there is a religious obligation to pursue justice, to stand up for someone who misrepresents Judaism and Jewish values. I would conclude by something that, again, I said yesterday in the Orthodox synagogue. One of the commandments we have, we read yesterday about it, not only pursue justice, as I mentioned, but also in order to pursue justice, you have to have a court system. A court system, judicial system. And it's spelled in, and the Talmud spells out how you organize the judicial system. It has to have the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, and how it should be run. And there's one interesting obligation that is put on the Supreme Court, Sanhedrin. They were deciding the most serious cases, like murder. If someone is accused of murder, whether it's a death penalty, not a death penalty. So they were always discussing very serious issues. And the rule that Talmud spells out, that there was, say 23 judges, it's the youngest and the least experienced who speaks first. And then it goes on and on and on, and to the most experienced and the oldest speaks last. You can understand why. It creates a diversity of opinion. Because if the most experienced judge will say his opinion, who am I to object? Young people will not speak out. So the rule is the youngest speaks and the oldest speaks last. And suppose the case of murder is so clear that there is absolutely no doubt that that defendant is guilty, and the 23 vote that he is guilty, Jewish law says he is acquitted. It's impossible that 23 people would be unanimous. And therefore, they were carried away by sentiment, by emotions, by something extraneous. So if the 23 vote for condemning that criminal or that defendant, he's acquitted. And it sounds paradoxical, but in fact, much of Jewish tradition is based on tremendous suspicion of unanimity. Tremendous suspicion of unanimity. And I'll just finish with one little biblical story which all of you know. The Tower of Babel. So they wanted to build a tower, they wanted to go up, and then God destroyed the tower. But the question, why did God destroy it? Was he afraid that they would go to heaven and wage a war against them? Why do you think, oh, here we have specialists in religious studies. why was it destroyed? Let them build it. There must be an explanation. Does anyone know?
Challenge of authority.
But, you know, he can deal with that when he's not, you know, these humans over there are doing something. No, the explanation was given by a Jewish scholar, Sforno. He's one of the classical interpreters of the Bible. He lived in Italy, Renaissance Italy. I mention it because it directly relates. He says, and the biblical text says, we want it to be Am Echad, Safa Achat, Dvarim Achadim, which means we want it to be one nation, one language, and have the same idea. And Sforno adds, when people want this, usually they have a wrong idea. Thank you very much.